The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of the judge's gavel striking the desk. Everyone in the room knew it was time for the trial to begin. The air felt thick with anticipation. A well-known businessman, Henry Price, sat confidently at the defendant's table. He was dressed in a sharp suit, his expensive watch glinting in the light. He had no fear. After all, he was Henry Price, the man who built his empire from the ground up. He didn't expect a woman, especially a black woman, to stand in his way now. Judge Simone Blackwood stepped onto the raised platform in the front of the room. She was tall, calm, and commanding, with an air of authority that filled the entire space. Her black robe flowed behind her as she took her seat. Her eyes, dark and steady, scanned the room. She had seen it all. She had heard it all. Henry couldn't help but smirk. He had been in courtrooms countless times, but this one was different. This judge was different. She didn't look like the usual, older white men he was used to facing. He didn't think she could handle someone like him. The court clerk called the case and the trial began. The charges were serious: fraud, embezzlement, and corruption. Price had stolen millions, using his company's funds for personal gain. But he wasn't worried. With his wealth and power, he knew he could buy his way out of trouble. After all, who would believe the word of a simple judge over a rich businessman like him? As the trial proceeded, Henry became more and more comfortable. He leaned back in his chair, his feet propped up on the table. He looked around the room, noticing the way some of the people were eyeing him. There were whispers of his name, people looking at him with admiration and envy. He smiled to himself. He hadn't paid much attention to Judge Blackwood when the trial first started, but as he listened to her give instructions to the courtroom, he couldn't ignore her presence any longer. Her voice was steady and clear, but there was something about it that irritated him. It wasn't what she was saying, it was the way she was saying it. She spoke with such confidence. Her tone was firm, unshakable. It made Henry uneasy. He watched her closely as she gave instructions, her eyes locking with his from time to time. He could tell she was trying to make him uncomfortable, but it wasn't working. Henry had dealt with worse. He could play this game too. Suddenly, Henry leaned forward in his chair, a smile forming on his lips. He was about to make a statement. He couldn't let her think she could intimidate him. "Your Honor," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "I'm sure your experience in handling small cases like this has prepared you for a real challenge. But I must say, this is all rather beneath you, don't you think?" The courtroom fell silent. Judge Blackwood raised an eyebrow, her gaze still calm and steady. She didn't flinch. Henry continued, his words more pointed now. "I mean, I'm just a businessman," he said, his smirk growing wider. "What do I know about running a courtroom? Surely there's someone more qualified for this kind of job than you. A man, perhaps. Someone with a bit more experience. Maybe someone who understands how the world really works." A few people in the courtroom exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one dared to speak. Judge Blackwood, however, did not let his words get under her skin. She simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. Henry's smirk widened as he leaned back again, confident that he had made his point. He thought he had won the moment. But Judge Blackwood wasn't finished yet. She slowly stood up, her gaze never leaving his. She walked over to the bench and spoke in a soft, but clear voice that carried across the room. "I've heard your words, Mr. Price," she said, her tone even, yet tinged with authority. "You seem to think that your wealth and your position make you better than others. That's a mistake many people make. But today, you will learn that justice doesn't care about your money. It doesn't care about your status. It only cares about the truth." Henry's smile faltered for a moment. He hadn't expected her to respond like this. He had hoped she would cower, maybe even apologize for his rude behavior. But instead, she stood there, unwavering. There was something about her presence that made Henry feel small, something he hadn't felt in years. Judge Blackwood continued, her voice calm but full of power. "You may think you can buy your way out of this, Mr. Price, But let me remind you that no amount of money can change the truth. No amount of influence can change the law. For a brief moment, Henry felt a pang of uncertainty. It was fleeting, but it was there. He shook it off quickly, determined not to let her get to him. He would get through this. He always did. But as Judge Blackwood returned to her seat, her eyes never leaving him, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't going to go the way he had planned. The courtroom fell silent again. The weight of her words hung in the air, and Henry began to realize that this would not be a typical trial. This woman, this judge, wasn't like the others. She was something else entirely, and Henry Price was beginning to regret underestimating her. The trial continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. Henry Price could feel it in the air. Something was different. It wasn't just the fact that Judge Blackwood had not flinched under his harsh words. It was something deeper, something about the way she carried herself. As the hours ticked by, the courtroom grew tense. Henry had been used to controlling every situation. His wealth had gotten him out of many tight spots in life, and he had a network of powerful friends who would bend the law in his favor. But today, nothing seemed to work. Judge Blackwood was unfazed by his attempts to undermine her, and every time he tried to interrupt, her gaze would stop him in his tracks. By midday, Henry began to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: frustration. He had been asked to present his side of the case, but every time he spoke, he was met with questions and objections. Judge Blackwood kept him on track, forcing him to stay focused on the details of the case. "You seem to be dancing around the facts, Mr. Price," she said during one of his speeches. "You're claiming that these charges are fabricated, but there's a mountain of evidence pointing to the contrary. Explain that." Henry opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He felt trapped, his usual cleverness failing him for the first time in a long while. His mind raced, searching for an escape, but the walls seemed to close in around him. He had underestimated her. The rest of the day passed in a blur of witnesses and testimony. Henry's lawyers tried to fight back, but Judge Blackwood remained calm, cool, and composed. Each time they made a point, she countered it with precision. The prosecutor, a young woman named Lisa Reynolds, stood beside her, confidently presenting the case. At one point, as a key witness took the stand, Henry tried to make a move. He leaned over to his lawyer and whispered something urgently. He needed to make a call. There had to be someone who could help him. His empire was at stake. He couldn't lose everything now. But as he picked up his phone to dial, he noticed that Judge Blackwood's eyes were locked on him. She hadn't said a word, but her gaze was enough to send a chill down his spine. She knew. She knew exactly what he was doing. "You are not allowed to make private calls during the trial, Mr. Price," she said quietly, but with undeniable authority. Henry felt his face flush with anger. This woman was impossible. How could she possibly understand the stakes? How could she not see that he was untouchable, that no one could defeat him? But when he tried to argue, the prosecutor, Lisa Reynolds, stood up and addressed the judge directly. "Your Honor, we have to consider the pattern of behavior here. Mr. Price has been trying to delay the proceedings and evade the charges since the start. It's clear that he believes his status entitles him to avoid facing the consequences of his actions." Judge Blackwood didn't respond immediately. She only nodded slowly, acknowledging Lisa's point. Henry clenched his jaw, but deep down, he knew she was right. His behavior was growing erratic, desperate even. The walls were closing in, and he had no way out. Later that afternoon, the court took a break for lunch. As Henry walked out of the courtroom, his head spun. His usual confidence was nowhere to be found. He was starting to realize that his money, his status, and his connections might not be enough to get him out of this. For the first time in years, he was truly vulnerable. He stood in the hallway, trying to collect himself, when his phone buzzed. It was a text from his assistant, Anna. "Mr. Price, I've spoken to our contacts. They say Judge Blackwood is not someone we can intimidate. She has a very solid reputation. She's not like the others." Henry felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The words hung in the air. She's not like the others. He didn't like the sound of that. For the first time in his life, Henry Price was beginning to understand that he wasn't in control. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Anna. Mr. Price, the judge has a history of taking down people who think they're above the law. You've got to be careful. Henry's mind raced. He had to turn this around. He couldn't let some woman destroy everything he had worked for. The idea that she could crush his empire without even breaking a sweat terrified him. When he returned to the courtroom, the tension was even thicker than before. The trial resumed, and Henry tried to force a calm demeanor, but the cracks were beginning to show. He had always prided himself on his ability to manipulate the situation in his favor, but today he found himself powerless. Judge Blackwood sat at the bench, her eyes scanning the room. As she looked at Henry, there was no hint of doubt in her expression. She knew what he was trying to do. She had seen men like him before, arrogant, rich, and entitled. She had no intention of letting him get away with it. The trial continued through the afternoon, but by the end of the day, Henry's confidence had been shattered. His lawyers were growing increasingly worried. The weight of the evidence was undeniable, and the case against him was strong. Even if he managed to avoid conviction, he could already feel the public turning against him. The power he had spent years building was slipping through his fingers. The session was adjourned for the day, and Henry left the courtroom with his head low. The day's events had left him questioning everything he thought he knew about power and control. He had always been in charge, always in command of the room. But today, Judge Blackwood had flipped the script. For the first time in his life, he felt like the one being judged. The courtroom was packed again the next morning. People were whispering, phones were buzzing, and news reporters stood outside, waiting for something big. Everyone could feel it. Something was about to happen. Henry Price walked in with a forced smile. He wore an expensive suit, trying to look calm and confident. But his eyes told a different story. He hadn't slept well. He kept thinking about Judge Blackwood and her calm, fearless attitude. No matter what he did or said, she stayed strong. He tried to act like everything was fine. He nodded at his lawyer. But deep inside, his chest was tight. He felt like he was losing control. When Judge Blackwood entered the room fell silent. She looked calm as always, but her eyes were sharp. She sat down, looked at her files, and then raised her head slowly. "Before we begin," she said, "I'd like to address something important." Henry sat up straighter. She looked at the court clerk and nodded. The clerk stood and handed her a brown folder. "These were just received this morning," she said, "and they change a lot." Henry's heart dropped. The judge opened the folder, pulled out a few papers, and held one up. "We have discovered sealed documents, government-level documents. These are related to the early career of the defendant, Mr. Henry Price." Whispers filled the courtroom. Even Henry's lawyer looked confused. Henry frowned. "That's impossible," he muttered. Judge Blackwood continued. "According to these records, Mr. Price worked with multiple high-ranking military contractors over 10 years ago. Some of these groups had ties to international deals, illegal ones." Gasps. People turned to look at Henry. His face was pale now. "That part of your past," the judge said, "was covered up, but not erased." Henry stood up. "This is nonsense. I left those groups years ago. None of this has anything to do with this case." Judge Blackwood didn't raise her voice. "It has everything to do with this case, Mr. Price. You've been pretending to be an honest businessman, but your past shows how deep your corruption runs." Henry's lawyer tried to object, but the judge raised a hand. "I've seen enough," she said firmly. "You've bribed people, stolen millions, and hurt innocent families with fake contracts. And now you think you can disrespect this court, disrespect me, and walk away free." Henry sat down slowly. His hands were shaking. He couldn't hide anymore. The walls were closing in. And then it got worse. The prosecutor, Lisa Reynolds, stood up and said, "Your Honor, I have a surprise witness." The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. A tall man walked in. He wore a simple black suit, but his presence was powerful. He had a scar across his left cheek and moved with the calm strength of a soldier. Henry froze. The man walked to the witness stand, swore his oath, and sat down. Judge Blackwood asked, "State your name." The man said, "Colonel James Maddox, retired." More gasps. Lisa spoke again. Colonel Maddox was Mr. Price's commanding officer, back when he worked on top-secret missions. He has stories, dark ones. Henry's head dropped. He knew it was over. Colonel Maddox began to speak. He told the court how Henry used his skills for personal gain, how he betrayed fellow agents, how he leaked information for money. People were shocked. Some even covered their mouths. And then Colonel Maddox said, "One of those actions led to the death of a good man. He had a wife and 2 kids." The room went completely silent. Henry looked up slowly. For a second, guilt showed in his eyes. Judge Blackwood leaned forward. "Do you have anything to say, Mr. Price?" He opened his mouth, but no words came out. She nodded. "That's what I thought." The trial was no longer about just one case. It was about truth, about exposing a man who had hidden behind money, lies, and power. And now, that man had nowhere left to hide. Henry Price sat in his chair, still as stone. His expensive suit looked useless now. His face, once full of pride, was pale and sweaty. The courtroom was no longer his stage. All eyes were on Judge Blackwood. Judge Blackwood slowly removed her glasses and looked around the room. Her voice was calm but strong. "This courtroom," she said, "has seen many cases, but today is different. Today, we are not just deciding one man's guilt. We are showing the world that power does not protect you from justice." Henry's lawyer stood up quickly. "Your Honor, we request a delay." "Denied," the judge said firmly. "You had your chance. This court has more than enough proof." She turned to Colonel Maddox, still sitting in the witness box. "Thank you, Colonel, for your service and your courage to speak the truth." He gave a small nod and stepped down. Then the judge looked back at Henry. "You know what hurts the most, Mr. Price? Not your crimes, but the way you laughed, the way you mocked this court, as if no one could touch you." Henry looked down. His hands were shaking. "And let's talk about that day," she continued. "That day you insulted me, called me just another woman in a robe. You didn't know who I was. You didn't know my story." Everyone leaned forward. Even the reporters outside were listening closely. Judge Blackwood stood up. "My father was a janitor. My mother worked 3 jobs. I grew up poor, hungry, and judged, just like the people you hurt with your fake contracts and lies. But I studied hard. I served in the army. I worked my way through law school. And I never forgot where I came from." People in the courtroom began nodding. Some had tears in their eyes. "I've been silent about my past," she said, "but not today." She opened a small folder on her desk and pulled out a picture. She held it up for the court. "This is me, 15 years ago, standing next to General Maddox. We were in Iraq. I was a military lawyer, helping local families who had lost everything. You were there too, Mr. Price, but you were on the wrong side." Henry's eyes widened. He remembered. He had seen her before, long ago. But back then, he didn't care who she was. "You thought I was just a judge," she said. "But I was watching you for a long time, quietly, carefully. And now, the time has come." She took a deep breath and picked up the sentencing papers. "In this court, we don't just punish, we send a message. And today, this message is loud." She looked Henry in the eyes. "Henry James Price, you are hereby sentenced to 40 years in federal prison without parole." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Henry jumped to his feet. 40 years. This is personal revenge. "No," the judge replied calmly. "This is justice, and you made it personal the day you insulted this court, this community, and everyone who works hard for an honest life." Two officers walked over and took Henry by the arms. He fought at first, shouting, "You'll regret this. You're nothing without that robe." But then something happened. The people in the courtroom stood up, one by one, quiet at first, but then louder. They clapped, not just for the sentence, but for the truth, for the judge, for the courage. As the officers dragged Henry out, he looked around at the standing crowd. His voice broke, his face twisted in disbelief. For once in his life, no one listened to him. Judge Blackwood sat back down, silent but proud. She looked out at the crowd, faces from all walks of life, and gave them a small nod. And in that moment, everyone knew this wasn't just a courtroom victory. It was a victory for every person who was ever looked down on, ever disrespected, ever silenced. The truth had finally won. The courtroom was quiet again. The crowd had slowly left, but the energy in the room still remained. Some called it justice. Others called it history. Judge Blackwood sat alone at the bench. The papers were signed. The cameras had been turned off. The courtroom lights dimmed, but her heart was still beating fast. She looked down at the file that started it all. Henry Price's case, thick, filled with evidence, lies, and pain. It had taken months to build, years to understand. She closed it slowly and whispered, "Done." Just then, her clerk, a young woman named Rachel, walked in. She looked nervous but proud. "Judge," she said softly, "there's someone waiting outside. He asked to speak with you." Judge Blackwood raised an eyebrow. "Who?" He didn't give his name, but he said, "You saved his mother once. In Iraq." Judge Blackwood's eyes softened. She stood up and walked to the door. Outside stood a tall young black man, dressed in military uniform. He stood straight, his hands behind his back. When he saw her, he saluted. She gave him a warm smile. "No need for that, soldier. Who are you?" He hesitated, then said, "I'm Marcus Lane. My mother was Dr. Layla Lane. You helped her and my little sister escape when our home was bombed. You stayed with us all night, even when the base was under attack." The judge remembered. She had held that little girl in her arms while the bombs fell outside. She had promised their mother they'd be safe. Tears filled her eyes. "Your mother," she asked, "is she?" "She passed last year," Marcus said quietly. "But before she died, she told me that if I ever met you, I should say thank you. She never forgot what you did." The judge put her hand over her heart. "I never forgot her either." Marcus looked around the courtroom building. People like Price, they think justice is weak. But today, you reminded the world what strength really looks like. Judge Blackwood nodded. "It's not about power. It's about truth." Then something surprising happened. More people began to gather outside the court. Not protesters, not press, just regular people, men and women, young and old, from all backgrounds. Some held signs, not angry ones, but signs that read, "Thank you, Judge Blackwood. Truth matters. One voice can change everything." The judge stepped outside. The crowd clapped gently, not loudly, but with deep respect. Some had tears. Others stood quietly, just to be present. A young girl stepped forward. She looked only 8 years old. She handed the judge a small bouquet of wildflowers. "My mom says you're a hero," she said shyly. Judge Blackwood knelt down and took the flowers. "No, sweet girl. I'm just someone who refused to stay silent." Then she looked at the people gathered and raised her voice just enough to be heard. Today wasn't just about one man. It was about every woman, every man, every child who has ever been made to feel small. You are not small. You matter. The crowd nodded. A few clapped again. And for the first time in many years, Judge Blackwood felt peace. Not because a rich businessman had been punished, But because truth had been seen, justice had spoken, and the world had listened, she turned to go back inside. But before closing the door, she looked at the sky. The sunset was golden, strong, and full of promise, just like her journey, just like the people she fought for. And as the last light touched the courthouse steps, one thing was clear. This was not the end. It was the beginning of something bigger. A reminder to all. Respect is earned, justice is delivered, and silence is no longer an option.